Alien parents request human playground designers because our children know true joy. Part 1. Ambassador had seen many strange things in his 200 years of diplomatic service. He had watched the sing entire cities into existence. He had witnessed the build thinking machines from pure crystal. He had stood on worlds where the sky burned purple and the rain fell upward. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw on the human colony world of New Brisbane. Children were throwing themselves off high platforms into pits of loose sand. His secondary hearts began to beat faster. His skin shifted to a deep blue color that meant alarm among his people. He pressed one of his 4 hands against the observation window and leaned closer, certain that he must be misunderstanding what he saw. "They are going to hurt themselves," he said to the human woman standing beside him. "Should we not intervene?" Dr. Sarah smiled at him. It was a strange expression that humans made by pulling their lips back from their teeth. The first time had seen a human smile, he had thought it was a threat display. Now he knew it usually meant the opposite. "They're fine," she said. "That's a sandbox. Children play in it." Play, the word translated poorly into his language. The closest meaning was something like activity without purpose. Yes, play, it's what children do. Watched as a small human child climbed up a metal structure that seemed designed to be difficult to climb. The child's hand slipped twice. Once, the child nearly fell, but the child kept climbing until it reached a platform at the top. From there, the child slid down a curved metal surface and landed in the sand below with a loud sound of joy. Then the child got up and did it again. "I do not understand," said. "The activity serves no educational function. The child is not learning a skill. The child is not being prepared for adult responsibilities. The child is simply doing things." Doctor's smile grew wider. "That's exactly right. The child is simply doing things, having fun." Fun, another word that did not translate well. The concept seemed to mean enjoyment derived from activities that serve no practical purpose. Among his people, such things were considered wasteful. Time was precious. Children were precious. Why would anyone allow precious children to waste precious time? He continued to watch. More children arrived at the play area. They ran in patterns that seemed random. They climbed and jumped and fell and got back up. They chased each other and shouted and laughed. One child fell from a low platform and scraped its knee on the ground. It cried for a short time while an adult applied a small bandage. Then it returned to the platform and tried again. "The child was injured," said, "and yet it returns to the activity that caused the injury. Is this not concerning?" "It's healthy," Doctor said. "Children need to learn their limits. They need to fall sometimes so they can learn how to get back up." Thought about the child-raising facilities on his. Children were kept in carefully controlled environments from the moment they were born. Every surface was soft. Every activity was monitored by artificial intelligence systems that would stop any action that might cause harm. Children never fell because they were never allowed to climb high enough to fall. Children never failed because every challenge was carefully designed to match their exact level of ability. Children were safe, they were optimized, they were prepared. But could not remember ever seeing a child make the sound that these human children were making. This wild, uncontrolled noise that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep inside them. This sound of pure, unreasonable happiness. He submitted his report to the Galactic Council that night. The response came within hours. They wanted more information. They wanted researchers. They wanted to understand what the humans were doing that no other species had ever thought to do. Within one standard month, a team of scientists arrived from 12 different worlds. They set up observation posts around the human playground. They measured the chemicals in the children's bodies. They recorded every movement, every sound, every interaction. They collected more data in 1 week than most developmental studies gathered in a year. Dr. was the first to identify what they were seeing. They were known throughout the galaxy for their empathic abilities. They could feel the emotions of other beings as clearly as most species could see colors. Doctor had spent her career studying the emotional development of children across hundreds of worlds. "I have never felt anything like this," she told the research team. Her body glowed with soft pulses of light that indicated deep emotional response. The human children are not simply tolerating the uncertainty of their environment. They are seeking it. They are drawn to challenge and risk the way other species are drawn to safety and comfort. She paused and closed her many eyes for a moment, as if listening to something the others could not hear. "And when they overcome a challenge," she continued, "when they reach the top of the climbing structure or catch their friend in a chase, they experience a surge of positive emotion that is almost overwhelming. It radiates from them like heat from a star." "What do they call this emotion?" asked a researcher, its crystalline form flickering with interest. Doctor turned to Doctor, who had been helping translate human concepts for the team. "They call it fun," Doctor said, "or joy, or happiness. They have many words for it because they experience it in many forms." The research continued for 6 more months. The scientists studied human playgrounds on 20 different worlds. They interviewed parents and teachers and child development experts. They compared their findings to the child-raising practices of every known species in the galaxy. The conclusion was unanimous and shocking. Human children were happier than any other children in the known universe, not by a small amount, by a large amount. The measurements were clear. The emotional intensity that human children experienced during play was 3 to 5 times higher than what children of other species experienced during their most positive activities. But the implications went beyond happiness. Human children also showed higher rates of creativity. They were better at solving problems that had no obvious solution. They were more resilient when they faced difficulties. They recovered faster from disappointment and failure. They formed stronger bonds with other children. The researchers traced all of these advantages back to the same source, the playgrounds. Specifically, the playground's deliberate inclusion of risk, challenge, and uncertainty. Human children were not protected from every possible harm. They were allowed to climb high enough to fall. They were allowed to run fast enough to stumble. They were allowed to try things that might not work. And in that freedom, they found something that no amount of optimization could provide. They found joy. Ambassador read the final report in his quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel. He thought about the children back on his, safe in their padded rooms, monitored by their caring machines. He thought about how quiet those rooms were, how orderly, how efficient. He thought about the human children screaming with laughter as they threw themselves into pits of sand. For the first time in his long career, he understood that his people might have made a terrible mistake. They had tried to protect their children from all harm. In doing so, they had protected them from joy itself. He began composing a message to his government. It would be controversial. It might end his career, but he knew it was necessary. The message was simple. It said that they needed to build playgrounds, real playgrounds, the kind that human children used, the kind where children could fall, the kind where children could learn to fly. Part 2. The message arrived at Terran Playground Design Solutions on a quiet Tuesday morning. Was sitting in his office, drinking his third cup of coffee, and looking over plans for a new play area in a small town called. He had been designing playgrounds for 23 years. He knew every safety standard, every material specification, every trick for making a climbing structure that was challenging enough to be interesting but safe enough to satisfy worried parents. He had never received a message from an alien civilization before. The sender was the collective, one of the oldest and most advanced species in the known galaxy. The message was formal and polite and very long. Read it 3 times to make sure he understood what it was asking. They wanted to hire human designers to build playgrounds for their children. Sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he called his business partner and asked her to come to his office immediately. "This has to be a joke," said after reading the message. "Alien governments don't hire playground designers from Earth." "Apparently this one does," said. The message explained that they had been studying human child development practices for nearly a year. They had observed human playgrounds on many colony worlds. They had measured the results. They had concluded that human children were healthier, happier, and more resilient than children. They wanted to know why. More importantly, they wanted to change. 2 months later, stood on the surface of Prime, looking at what the locals called a child recreation facility. It was beautiful. The walls were made of a crystal that changed color in response to touch. The floor was covered in a soft material that would cushion any fall. Holographic displays created images that responded to each child's individual preferences. The facility was perfect in every way, and it was completely silent. Children moved through the space in orderly patterns. They interacted with the displays calmly and efficiently. Monitoring systems tracked their every movement and adjusted the environment to ensure optimal stimulation levels. If a child's stress hormones rose above acceptable levels, the system would automatically intervene. No child struggled. No child failed. No child experienced a moment of uncertainty or fear. No child laughed. Spent 3 weeks visiting recreation facilities across Prime. He interviewed parents and teachers and child development specialists. He learned about the approach to raising children, which was based on 3,000 years of scientific research and optimization. Every aspect of a child's environment was designed to maximize positive outcomes. Nutrition was calculated to the molecule. Education was tailored to each child's unique cognitive profile. Social interactions were supervised and guided to prevent conflict. Physical activities were carefully controlled to prevent injury. The system produced children who were healthy, intelligent, and well-adjusted by every standard measure. But something was missing, something that they had never thought to measure because they did not know it existed. Tried to explain the concept at a meeting with the Design Council. 12 officials sat in a semicircle around him, their skin colors shifting as they processed his words. "Your facilities are perfect," he said. "That is the problem." The officials exchanged confused looks. "How can perfection be a problem?" asked the head of the council, a tall named. "We have removed all sources of stress and danger. We have created environments where children can develop without obstacle or hardship. Is this not what every species wants for its young?" Thought about how to answer. He thought about his own childhood, playing in the woods behind his house. He remembered climbing trees and falling out of them. He remembered building forts that collapsed and games that ended in arguments. He remembered the feeling of reaching the top of something tall and looking down at the world below. "Children need obstacles," he said. "They need hardship, not too much, not the kind that breaks them, but enough to make them grow." He told them about a concept called the zone of proximal development. It was an idea from human psychology. It meant that children learned best when they were challenged just beyond their current ability. Not so much that they failed completely, but enough that they had to struggle, had to try hard, had to push themselves. "When a child climbs a structure that is difficult for them, they are scared," said. "Their heart beats fast. They are not sure if they can do it. But when they reach the top, when they succeed despite their fear, something happens inside them. Something that cannot happen if the climb is easy. Something that cannot happen if there is no possibility of failure." "What happens?" asked. Smiled joy. The word hung in the air. They did not have a word for this concept. Their translators rendered it as something like satisfaction at optimal outcome, but that was not quite right. Joy was bigger than satisfaction. Joy was wild and unreasonable and sometimes came from things that made no practical sense at all. The council debated for many hours. Some members argued that human practices were dangerous and primitive. They pointed to statistics about childhood injuries on human worlds. They expressed concern about the psychological effects of allowing children to experience fear and failure. Other council members had seen the research. They knew that human children scored higher on every measure of creativity and resilience. They knew that human adults were better at adapting to unexpected challenges. They could not ignore the evidence that something in human child raising produced remarkable results. In the end, the council voted to try an experiment. They would build one playground using human design principles. They would allow children to use it. They would measure the results. Worked with a team of engineers to design the facility. It was a modest space by human standards. There was a climbing structure with multiple routes to the top. There was a slide that moved faster than children had ever experienced. There were swings that let children control their own motion. There was a sandbox where children could dig and build and make a mess. Every element was adjusted for physiology. The heights and distances were calculated to be challenging but survivable. The materials were tested to ensure they would not harm skin. The monitoring systems were still present, but they were set to intervene only in cases of genuine danger. The day the playground opened, 200 families came to watch. They stood behind barriers and observed with nervous eyes as a group of children were led into the facility. The first child to approach the climbing structure was a young female named. She was 7 years old by counting, which made her roughly equivalent to a human 5-year-old. She had never seen a climbing structure before. She did not know what to do with it. She put one hand on the lowest bar and pulled herself up. Her feet left the ground. She hung there for a moment, uncertain. The monitoring system began to flash warnings. Stress hormones were rising. Her heart rate was elevated. By standards, she was in distress. The system prepared to intervene. Held up his hand. "Wait," he said, "just wait." Reached for the next bar. Her hand slipped. She grabbed again and held on. Slowly, carefully, she began to climb. The watching parents made sounds of distress. Several tried to move toward the barrier. Security officials held them back. Everyone watched as climbed higher than any child had climbed in 1,000 years. She froze halfway up. Her skin turned a pale gray color that indicated fear. She looked down at the ground below her and did not move. "She is in distress," said. "We must help her." "She is learning," said. "Watch." For 97 seconds, clung to the bars and did not move. Then something shifted in her posture. Her grip tightened. She looked up at the platform above her instead of down at the ground below. She reached for the next bar. She climbed. When she reached the top, she stood on the platform and looked out at the crowd of watching adults. Her skin had changed color. It was no longer gray with fear. It was bright gold. No present had ever seen that color before. They did not know what it meant. But did. He had seen it on the faces of human children 1,000 times. Threw back her head and made a sound that her people had not heard in 3,000 years of recorded history. It was loud and wild and full of something that had no name in the language. It was the sound of joy. Part 3. 5 years had passed since climb to the top of that first playground on Prime. In that time, everything had changed. The video of her reaching the platform had spread across the galaxy faster than any diplomatic message or scientific discovery. Billions of beings watched a small child do something that no child of her species had done in generations. They watched her face change color. They heard the sound she made. They saw joy. Within 1 year, they had built 300 playgrounds across there. Within 2 years, they had built thousands more on their colony worlds. Human designers worked alongside engineers, teaching them the principles that made play spaces effective. How to create challenge without creating danger. How to give children freedom without abandoning them. How to let them fall without letting them break. The results were measured carefully, as they measured everything. Child happiness indicators rose by 400%. Creativity scores improved across every age group. Social bonding among young reached levels not seen since before their species developed advanced technology. But they were not the only ones paying attention. They had a problem that was almost the opposite of this. Their children were born with powerful empathic abilities. They could feel the emotions of everyone around them. In the past, this had been a gift. Communities were close and harmonious because everyone could sense what everyone else was feeling. But as society grew and technology brought strangers into closer contact, the gift became a burden. Young were overwhelmed by the flood of emotions from crowds of unfamiliar beings. Many developed what human psychologists called anxiety, some completely unable to cope with the intensity of their own abilities. The response had been to create dampening fields, special zones where empathic abilities were suppressed. Children were raised in these zones, protected from the emotional noise of the outside world. They grew up calm and stable, but they also grew up weak. Their empathic gifts, unused in childhood, never developed fully. By adulthood, many could barely sense emotions at all. Doctor, the researcher who had first studied human playgrounds, proposed a different approach. Instead of dampening emotions, what if children learned to process them? What if they practiced feeling intense emotions in controlled settings, the way human children practiced climbing in playgrounds? They built what they called feeling gardens. These were spaces where children could experience the full range of emotional intensity without dampening fields. But the emotions were carefully selected: joy from other children playing, excitement from storytellers performing, the warm contentment of family gatherings, positive emotions, intense but not overwhelming. The gardens also included human-designed play elements, climbing structures where children could feel their own fear and triumph, racing games where they could experience the thrill of competition, sandboxes where they could sense the satisfaction of building something with their own hands. The first generation of children raised in feeling gardens showed remarkable results. They were not overwhelmed by their empathic abilities. They were strengthened by them. The practice of feeling intense emotions had trained their minds to process rather than be flooded. They became the most emotionally intelligent in recorded history. Other species followed. The beings of living crystal who reproduced by growing new consciousnesses in computational matrices asked human consultants to help them design what they called uncertainty algorithms. For 10,000 years, children had been raised in perfectly efficient learning environments. Every problem had a clear solution. Every path led to optimal outcomes. The uncertainty algorithms introduced imperfection. Sometimes problems did not have clear solutions. Sometimes paths led nowhere. Children, for the first time, had to improvise. They had to adapt. They had to try things that might fail. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. The new generation of were more creative, more flexible, more alive than any who had come before. On Earth, Dr. Sarah watched these changes with amazement. She had become the director of a new institution called the Galactic Institute for Play Studies. Her job was to help other species understand what humans had always known instinctively: that children needed more than safety, that they needed challenge and adventure, and the chance to discover their own strength. One morning she received a message from Prime. It was a video file tagged with a note that said simply, "Thank you." She opened the file and saw a park unlike anything that had existed on Prime 5 years before. Thousands of children ran and climbed and played in a space designed for joy. They chased each other across open fields. They built structures in sandboxes and knocked them down. They swung on swings and slid down slides and fell and got back up and tried again. In the center of the park stood a statue. It was the first monument any alien species had ever built to honor humanity. The statue showed a human child in mid-jump, arms spread wide, face frozen in an expression of pure delight. Sarah read the inscription at the base of the statue. It had been translated into 17 languages. They taught us that to live fully, our children must be allowed to fall, and in falling, they learned to fly. She closed the video and wiped her eyes. Then she went back to work, because there were still hundreds of species who had not yet learned what play could give their children. 3 years later, the Galactic Council held a special session to discuss cross-species child development. Representatives from over 1,000 worlds gathered to hear the results of the largest study ever conducted on childhood happiness and growth. A researcher named Ani presented the findings. She was the daughter of the original ambassador who had watched human children playing on New Brisbane so many years before. Her father had died the previous year, but not before seeing his transformed by the changes he had helped begin. For 3,000 years, Ani said, the believed that optimal child development meant removing all obstacles from a child's path. We measured success by the absence of struggle. We measured happiness by the absence of stress. We created environments where nothing bad could ever happen. She paused and looked around the great chamber. We were wrong. She presented data from 17 different species that had adopted human-inspired play practices. In every case, the results were the same. Children who experienced controlled challenge and appropriate risk grew up healthier, happier, and more capable than children who were protected from all hardship. The humans taught us something that seems obvious now but was invisible to us before, Ani continued. They taught us that struggle is not the enemy of happiness. Struggle is the source of happiness. The joy of achievement cannot exist without the possibility of failure. The pride of strength cannot exist without the experience of weakness. She brought up an image on the display. It showed two children standing at the top of a climbing structure. One was human. The other was, they were holding hands and laughing. Our children do not merely tolerate human playgrounds, Ani said. They love them. They love the challenge and the chaos and the freedom. They love the falls and the victories and the friendships made in sandbox negotiations. They love the feeling of their own power, discovered through effort. She spread her arms wide, a gesture she had learned from watching human children. Our children know true joy, and for that gift we will be grateful to humanity forever. The chamber erupted in sound. Representatives from 1,000 worlds made their species versions of applause. It lasted for many minutes. In the human section, Dr. Sarah sat quietly and thought about all the playgrounds on all the worlds that now echoed with the laughter of alien children. She thought about scraped knees and triumphant climbs in sandbox castles. She thought about parents who had learned to step back and let their children struggle. She thought about what humanity had given the galaxy, not technology or weapons or political systems, something simpler, something more profound. They had given them play. They had given them the wisdom to let children fall. And in falling, children of 1,000 species had learned to fly. Outside the council chamber, in a park built on the grounds of the Galactic Council complex, children of dozens of species played together. They climbed and ran and shouted and laughed. A child helped a child reach a high platform. A human child taught a child how to build a group of children whose species had been strangers a generation ago chased each other in circles, screaming with joy. They did not know about the speeches being made inside. They did not care about scientific studies or cultural transformations. They only knew that the sun was warm and the playground was waiting, and there were friends to play with. They knew that if they fell, they could get back up. They knew that the top of the climbing structure was worth the scary climb to reach it. They knew joy. And across the galaxy, more children were learning the same lesson every day, on playgrounds built by a species that had never forgotten how to play. The humans had given the galaxy many things over the years, but this was the gift that mattered most. They had taught the universe that childhood was not a problem to be solved. Childhood was a miracle to be lived. And the best way to live it was to play.